Christian apologist Sean McDowell recently took to the stage at Cross Assembly Church at Raleigh, North Carolina, and found himself tap dancing around a rather prickly question, a question that many have pondered.
So here's what, if God demands our praise and worship, we see that all over the Bible, well, doesn't that mean he's just a big narcissist? What kind of God would demand you worship him and praise him? That sounds like narcissism.
Welcome to Trinity Radio. We'll hear Sean's answer to this question in just a moment. But since it's already been suggested to you that what you're going to hear is Sean tap dancing through his answer, just rest assured that toward the end of this video, we're going to see that Stephen is actually tap dancing around the most obvious answer that one could give to this question, one that makes sense of everything that Sean is saying. With that, let's jump back in and hear how Sean answers.
It's wrong for us to be narcissistic and selfish, because that's to ignore other people, and we shouldn't put the focus upon ourselves. But God is not human. He's not finite. He's not created. God is the kind of being by his very existence that we should talk about, we should worship, we should focus on.
From a logical perspective, we must question whether attributes like arrogance and narcissism are compatible with God's traditional omni-attributes, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnibenevolence. In other words, the issue isn't just whether God's behavior is morally acceptable.
We should worship, we should focus on.
But, more importantly, whether such behaviors are logically coherent within the concept of a perfect deity.
Stephen is engaging in an internal criticism here. Now, an internal criticism is where you assume the reality of the thing that we're talking about for the sake of argument so that you can look at it from inside and see, if I accept what you're saying, is it coherent or is it incoherent? If you took The Lord of the Rings as an example, one would be doing an internal criticism if they said something like, well, if all of this is the way that the story portrays, why didn't the hobbits just ride those giant eagles all the way to Mordor and just toss the ring in?
Okay. All right. I am so angry. As a Tolkien nerd, this is nonsense.
In other words, it's testing the internal logic of the story. But what if, on the other hand, someone said, well, this just doesn't make any sense because there isn't a Mordor. It's not even a real place. Tolkien just made it up and everyone should know that. Well, okay, fair enough, except now you're not doing an internal criticism anymore. So what Stephen is essentially doing is saying, if we imagine your God as you say, then does it make logical sense for him to demand worship? Stephen doesn't think so. And that's because, too, he thinks that God is arrogant and narcissistic. How could a God of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence demand worship? Doesn't this just seem arrogant and narcissistic? Well, that depends on what we mean by that kind of terminology. If you survey the definitions of arrogance and narcissism, commonly they involve an exaggerated sense of one's own self-importance, or at least the projection of that. For instance, the Oxford Languages Dictionary defines arrogance as having or revealing an exaggerated sense of one's own importance or abilities. Now, if we're doing an internal critique, and if we're talking about a God who has the omni attributes, is he displaying an exaggerated sense of self-importance when he demands our worship? No. Is it even possible for him to have an exaggerated sense of self-importance or his abilities? Again, no. We're talking about God, a maximally great being. Arrogance doesn't even make sense as a criticism of him. We're talking about a being that is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. How could he even possibly have an exaggerated sense of his own abilities or self-importance? It just doesn't even make any sense. And this makes sense of Sean's comments that he's not finite. He is the creator, and in this sense, wholly different than us. So yes, when we display an exaggerated sense of our own importance or abilities, we're being arrogant. We can come off as quite pompous, and YouTubers know something about that. So if God describes his own greatness or demands that we worship him, you may not like it, but that's not arrogance. That's just not even a relevant term. It's just not a thing for God. Now, next, Sean talks about an incredible mountain and how we might stand in awe of such a vision, an incredible mountain out there in creation. And he draws the conclusion that if it makes sense that you would stand in awe of this mountain, there's like a sense of worshipful awe almost there. Well, how much more should you have that toward the one who created the mountain? Watch.
Well, God's not just the mountain. He's the creator of the mountain. He's the self-existent, all good, all-knowing, eternal, perfectly good creator of the universe, it would be wrong not to worship God.
Question: how does being a creator automatically entitle one to worship? It doesn't. Parents create children, but we don't insist that offspring must worship their parents. Respect and appreciation, perhaps, but worship crosses the line into a different realm, especially under the threat of eternal torment. But what about being good? If something is good, are they entitled to demand praise, and in the process, somehow not arrogant? Why is it that once a being maxes out their good meter, they all of a sudden unlock this gross entitlement? And again, if God is self-sufficient and perfectly good, why would he want worship? Wanting something implies a deficiency, which contradicts the notion of a perfect being. An all-knowing God would be already fully aware of his grandeur without requiring constant reminders from us. Additionally, declaring that it's
wrong not to worship God
reduces morality to mere obedience. It suggests that the highest moral action is subservience, not kindness, compassion, or justice. It depicts God as entirely unworthy of praise, which is the very point of the argument that Sean has completely missed.
Okay, but is this about God's need to be worshipped? When Paul gave his speech at the Areopagus in Athens in Acts chapter 17, he said, "The God who made the world and everything that is in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made by hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things." So biblically speaking, this isn't about what God needs for his own ego. Got it. Now let's plug all this in and see what we have on the table. God doesn't need to be worshiped just to fuel his ego or to be reminded of how great he is, but he does demand us to worship him, and we have this awareness of a sense of worshipful awe that we see in creation, like a beautiful, majestic mountain. And further, Sean seems to think that God's goodness is really important to all of this, even though Stephen seems to struggle to see why.
Why is it that once a being maxes out their good meter, they all of a sudden unlock this gross entitlement?
So here's the question. Can you think of any reason why God still might demand our worship if he doesn't need it for his own ego? What makes sense of everything Sean says and addresses Stephen's criticisms? If God exists as the very locus of truth, goodness, and beauty, then orienting your life worshipfully around the source of truth, goodness, and beauty is the best thing for mankind. It's good for you to orient your life around the locus of all truth, goodness, and beauty. The incredibly beautiful mountain is a reflection of God's truth, goodness, and beauty, but it's not the source. Orienting one's life around anything that is not the locus of truth, goodness, and beauty will be less good than orienting your life around God, who is. In fact, it will be bad. So worshipfully orienting your life around God is not about feeding his ego. It's about what's best for you, not him. It turns out Stephen had this whole thing backwards. When I was watching this video originally, it was like the obvious answer to me. Now, you might say, well, orienting your life around God, I don't think is orienting your life around the locus of truth, goodness, and beauty. But then you're just breaking the internal criticism. In the end, Stephen nor anyone else has to orient their life around God. You can orient it around something else, but that would be a bad choice. Not because of how it will affect God, but because of how orienting your life around the source of truth, goodness, and beauty could have impacted you, could have affected your life.